In this video, I'm going to be talking about file management, and I'm going to start off with a very common problem that you're more than likely to have come across, especially if you work on a shared environment between Mac and Windows. The Windows machines use drive letters and the Mac machines don't, so whenever you save a file on one system then try and open it on the other, you find that the paths can't be resolved, and then you're presented with a whole load of missing textures, and it's very annoying. There is actually a very simple solution to this problem, which I'm going to show you now. Now, I have to face this problem all the time because I have two different computers that I work on, and they use completely different drive letters for where the files are stored. But there's a really easy way to resolve this within Modo. So just to explain how it works, I'm going to show you that I've got a folder on my F drive called Live Projects, and this all the files relating to this tutorial are in a subfolder here called Animation Rendering. Now on my other system, it's not mapped to the same drive. It's not on F, it's on E. So I need to be able to open and save files on both the systems without it causing conflicts. So if I switch to Modo and we go to System Preferences, there is a section under Data called Path Aliases, and this is going to solve all your problems. And so what you need to do here is to define an alias with a unique name. So I've created one here called Live Projects. And then on each system that you're working on, you define exactly where that particular alias is going to point to on that system. And they can be using completely different file paths. It really doesn't matter. And what Modo will do is it will save that alias as part of the file every time the file is saved. And when you open it on any system that has this alias defined, it's going to look for where to find all the assets relating to this project, where this particular alias is pointing to on each individual system. And so you're never going to get conflicts, and you're never going to be asked for missing files. And as you can see, you can define more than one alias. You can define as many as you actually need. So it's a pretty flexible system. And what I then do is I make sure that everything that relates to this project is going to be found as a subfolder of the location this particular alias is pointing to. And in fact, I go a little bit further than that, and I actually make sure that I have a subfolder called Meshes. And in the Meshes subfolder, I have all my Modo files, but then as subfolders of these, then I store my animations separately, my textures separately, and also my published references all underneath this one folder, which basically contains everything that's relating to the 3D aspect of this project. Now, the next thing I'd like to talk about is referencing. The referencing system saw a big overhaul in Modo 8.01, and it's now much more powerful and flexible than the system that preceded it. It's much more suited to working on large productions and working with animation. So there's two things that I personally really like about the new referencing system. The first is that when you pull files in, you can decide exactly which parts of the file you want to reference, be it meshes or textures or environments, etc. The other thing is that you can have multiple levels of nested references. And this means you can completely decouple each part of your pipeline from all of the others. You can have one department working on assets, and then when they publish, the other departments have the assets automatically updated, which means essentially you can have modeling working at the same time as animation are working, at the same time as layout is working, at the same time as lighting is working. So it's really powerful and really flexible, and I'm going to show you how it works. To demonstrate the process, I'm going to start by importing a layout, which is essentially a modeled set or environment. So I'm going to go to File, Import Reference, and in my published files, I'm going to grab the workshop modeling. And all I want to bring in is the meshes. I don't want the shading and I don't want the lighting. So I'm just going to click OK, and it'll just take Modo a few seconds to bring in all the meshes. And now that I've imported the set that the shot is based in, the next thing I need to do is to bring in the character. So once again, I'm going to go to File, Import Reference, and this time I'm going to bring in my rigged character. Once again, I only want the meshes. I don't want any shading, lighting, etc. So I'm going to click OK and just wait a couple of seconds, and you can see that my character is now in the scene. Now, one major benefit of being able to pick and choose exactly what comes in with imported references is that you can make sure you're only really pulling in the assets that you actually need. Now in this case, because I want to start animating, I really only want the meshes. I definitely don't want any textures to come in because the textures on these assets are huge and there's lots of them. So that would mean slowing down my shader tree. It could potentially slow down my GL viewport, my preview window, slow down whenever I go to the images tab. Just makes file management a little bit more complicated and the files a little bit more heavy. And I really want everything to be as smooth as possible when I'm animating, so I really just bring in the meshes. However, one thing to bear in mind is that with this workflow, because you do have the ability to pull in textures later on from a completely different file, you could at this point use low-res preview textures if that's something that you wanted to use while you're animating. So what I'm going to do now is spend a little bit of time posing my character within the set, and I'll pause the video while I'm doing this and come back a little bit later. So having spent a little time posing my character, I've now saved the scene, and the next thing I'd like to do is to work on some initial lighting. But what I want to do in my lighting scene is to bring in this animation scene as a reference. One thing to be aware of is that Modo does not allow you to open the master scene and the reference scene at the same time in the same session of Modo. So for example, now that I've imported these two scenes as references, I can't then go and try and open the original scenes at the same time. Modo simply won't allow it. But there's also a ramification of this. It can get a little bit confused if you try and edit a scene, close it, and then straight away import it as a reference into a new scene. So because I'm planning to import this scene that I have now open as a reference in a new scene, before doing so, I'm going to restart Modo just to avoid any potential glitches. So with Modo now freshly restarted, I'm going to go to File, Import Reference, and I'm going to locate the file that I just had open. Here it is, Shot1v1. And all I'm going to do is import the meshes once again, because that's all I want from this particular file. And you can see after a few seconds that everything appears as it was in the scene. And you can see that I've got several layers now of nested references. I've got this Shot1v1, and within that there's two more layers of nested references which were in the original file that I was working on earlier. And so if I was to go and make any changes to any of the original files, for example, if I was to go to this workshop modeling publish file and make a change, that change would obviously then be propagated back throughout the entire chain. Now the next thing I need to do is to bring in my shading for the character and for the environment, and I've got these saved to disk as specific files. So I'm going to start with import reference, and I'm going to go to my published files, and I'm going to bring in the workshop shading. And this time all I'm going to bring in is the materials and shaders, because that's all I need to pull from this particular file. I'll just pause the video while this is coming in because it might take a little while to import. Now with the shading imported into my scene, you can see there's a new group in my shader tree. Now this has been automatically item masked to the reference item that I pulled in, which is this item here. But in this case, it's not what I want. I actually want it to be item masked here on the workshop modeling publish so that it actually finds the meshes that the textures are assigned to. So I'm going to go back to the item masking, and I'm simply going to change which item is masked to. So I'm going to change it to this group here rather than this one here. And as I do this, you can see that the textures are now correctly applied to the meshes in the scene. Now, just in case you're not really clear why I had to do this, it's because I've decoupled the shading from the modeling. So if you remember, when I pulled in the workshop modeling publish, I only brought in the meshes with no materials. But when I brought in the workshop shading publish, I only brought in the materials and not the models. So when this group came in, there was no modeling for the shading to be applied to, which is why it was incorrectly item masked, because it was item masked to an item that has no models in there whatsoever. So by changing the item masking on this group, I am now pointing it to a folder that's full of meshes, as you can see here. And once it finds that folder full of meshes, it can correctly apply the materials. Now, instead of changing the item mask, you could simply remove the item mask by setting it to all, which basically disables the item masking for that particular group. I just find it's a little bit cleaner and a little bit more controllable to do it this way by specifically pointing to which folder I want the item masking to be applied to. When it comes to material assignment, I tend to avoid item masking because it can cause problems in a pipeline. I always tend to stick to polygon tags for most cases because it means that If, for instance, item hierarchies get moved about, or things get put in folders, or things get removed from folders, item masking can very easily get messed up. And I don't always like limiting which items my materials are applied to, so I find that using polygon tags is a much more straightforward workflow. And if I expand my shading group that's been imported, you can see that on all these materials, I've been using polygon tags and not item masking. Polygon tags are just much more flexible, and it makes it much easier to manage the shading within a scene. Because, for example, if I was to import by reference different assets that are using the same materials, I could simply go up here and remove the item masking, and these materials would then automatically be applied to any other assets in any other groups that I might pull in, as long as they've been assigned the same polygon tag, that is. So for example, if I was to import another set of references with a different table that was using this same table legs material, if I then remove this item mask, this table legs material will be automatically applied to the other asset because it's polygon tagged, not item masked. So having imported the shading for my set, I now need to do the same for my character. So once again, I'm going to go to File, Import Reference, and this time I'm going to bring in the Android shading file. And once again, I'm only going to bring in the materials and shaders. I'll just pause the video while these are coming in. And once again, having imported the shaders, I've got a new group here in my shader tree which contains all the shading for my character. And once again, it's item masked to this group here, which is the reference I've just pulled in. But this is not what I want. I need it to be assigned here, where the meshes are. So I'm going to return to the properties for my texture group, and I'm going to change the item masking assignment to Android rigging published. And as I do this, the textures are going to update on my character. So now that my shading's up to date, I want to bring in some lighting, and I've created some initial lights in a separate file, so I'm going to reference that in as well. So I'm going to go to File, Import Reference, select the file and bring it in. Now when you're bringing in lights and environments, it's important to also bring in the materials and shaders, otherwise any shaders and materials that are included with your lights and environments will be missing. They're not imported independently, so just bear that in mind when you reference lighting and environments into a scene. So now that I've imported all the various elements that make up my scene independently from each other, it's time to unpause preview to see if all of this works. Probably going to take a minute or so for it to update, so I might just pause the video while it refreshes. And here is my result in preview, and you can see that everything seems to be working as it should. I've got lighting, I've got shading, my character is posed, my set is here and it appears to be complete. And I'm pulling everything in from completely separate reference files. So there's the pose of the character, which is being pulled in from one file. There's the layout of the set, which is being pulled from a separate file. The shading on both of these assets is coming again from two separate files. And finally, I've got the lighting coming from a fifth reference file. So that means that there's several departments could all be working on these assets at the same time, and any changes they make would be automatically propagated to this shot. So you can see it's a very powerful workflow and very flexible, because it means that you can have a lot of stuff going on at the same time. You're not waiting for one department to finish before you can start working on the next stage. Now, although this workflow is very powerful, it's still very important to do some basic housekeeping to any file that is designed to be referenced later on, and to make sure that you delete any unnecessary items within those files. Because if you don't do this, you'll probably find that your files are going to end up with lots of unnecessary items. They're going to hamper and slow down your productions. Another thing you should bear in mind is there's one item type that you have no control over when you import a file as a reference, and that is locators. Any locators that are present within a file that is being referenced will automatically be imported. And this can have repercussions if, for example, you want to decouple your rigged model from your shaded model, as I'm doing here. You just need to be aware that you don't want to duplicate any locators once you reference both scenes in. So that means that in the version of the character which is saved as the shaded file, I have to go through and delete the rig, because otherwise I would be importing the rig twice, once when I import the rigged character and a second time once I import the shaded character. Because even though I can opt to not import the geometry when I import the shading, I can't opt to not import the locators, so any rigging that would be present in the shaded file would be imported again, and that means that I will almost certainly run into problems because I've got a duplicate of my rig in the scene. And this could also be an issue if you're trying to decouple your lighting and environments from your shading, because remember that in order to successfully import lighting and environments, you also need to import the shading that's associated with those files. So if those files contain duplicate shading that is found in other files, if for example in your working lighting files you've got a shaded version of the set and the character, but you're also importing that in separately via the shading files that are dedicated to those assets, then you might run into conflicts. So it's just something to bear in mind. Any file that is going to be referenced should be tidied up in order to control exactly what is going to come in once you reference those files. And a really good way of dealing with all these issues is to use the concept of publishing. What I mean by that is before a file is referenced into a scene, it should be published. And that means that the file is no longer a work in progress, it is now a signed off asset ready to be used in production. And you only reference a published file to be used in a shot. And this has several advantages. The first one being that any published files can be cleaned up, either automatically by a script or by hand by a user. Because while a file is being worked on, you'll probably have lots of stuff in there that's really useful, such as lights, cameras, environments, anything that might help you do the work that's needed to be done. But once that asset is ready to go into production, all that stuff isn't needed anymore. So you might need to get rid of some rigging that you're using for your tests, some lighting that you're using for your test renders, so on and so forth. Once an asset is published, all that stuff can be eliminated. And by having the published files as a completely separate entity from your work in progress files, it means that your work in progress files will obviously still contain all these items that you need to carry on doing the work. So if you've got any amends, any revisions to do, you've still got your lights, your cameras, your environments, because they're kept separately from the published files, which are then cleaned up. And I think another big advantage of having a published system is that you can also break the referencing chain at specific points in your pipeline. And this is really important because with recursive referencing, you could have nested references that stretch back a really long way in your production, and this could become very hard to control and very unpredictable. To give an example of why breaking the chain of referencing might be useful, let's imagine that we've got a rigged character, and that rigged character is referenced into a new scene to be animated. And then once the animation is ready, the scene with the animation is then referenced into another new scene to go into lighting. So in this case, we've got two levels of nested references. Now let's imagine that 2 months down the line, you get a retake on your lighting scene. But in the meantime, the rigging department has also made some changes to the rig that is referenced on disk. But it just so happens by some unfortunate set of circumstances that the new rigging which is referenced on disk is breaking the old animation that was created before the rig was updated. And suddenly, instead of a simple lighting retake, you also find you got an animation retake and possibly a rigging fix as well. So what should have been a simple task is suddenly multiplied, and there's 3 departments involved with it instead of just the one. But this is actually really easy to avoid, because all you need to do is to simply break the chain. Rather than keeping the referencing live at all times, it's a good idea to, at certain points in your pipeline, bake the references into the scene. So for example, when an animation is signed off, I would do a publish, and in the publish I would bake the rig into the scene, which means that it's no longer being referenced. And that also means that if any changes are made to the rigging further on, they won't affect this particular animation, which is considered to be finished. Now, of course, just like any other publish process, you would keep a live version of the file with a live reference rig, just in case you needed to update the rig or update the animation. But in the published version, you would bake the references into the file, and it's the published version which would then be referenced into lighting. And so by limiting the recursive referencing that you've got going on in your files, you're going to find your workflow is going to be much easier to control, and you're going to get much more predictability. Now, the process of baking references into a scene in Modo is very specific, so I'll show you how to go about it. What you need to do is to save another copy of your file with a certain preference set. So I'm going to start by going to System, Preferences, and in Scene Save Export, I'm going to tick Merge Referenced Items. And having done that, I'm going to save a new version of my scene. So I'm going to go to File, Save As, and I'm going to call it bake.lxo. It'll take just a few seconds for Modo to save the file. And with the file saved, I'm now going to go back to preferences to untick this because I don't want to be baking my references into my scenes every time I save. Obviously in a pipeline, I recommend that you create a script to do this automatically for you. Now at first glance, you might think that nothing has changed. If I look in the item list, it looks as if all the referencing is still live. But actually what I need to do now is simply to close the scene and then reopen it. So this is what I'm going to do now. Close the scene and then go back to my recent files and reopen it. And with the scene reopened, if I look in the item list, I can see that indeed all the referencing has been removed and everything is now baked into the scene. So before concluding this look at referencing, I'm just going to talk to you about the very basics of referencing. So how to import references into a scene, how to manage overrides, how to use multiple versions of the same reference, that sort of thing. Now I've got an asset here which I'm going to import as a reference into another scene. And before I do that, the main thing I want to ensure is that the file is as tidy as possible, so there's no redundant items, there's no sort of disorganized stuff in here that's going to cause me problems later on. So the first thing I always ensure at this stage is that all my materials are applied with polygon tags and that there's no item masking at this stage. And the reason for this is that polygon tags are global, so they're much more flexible than using item masks, because item masks will always be limited to one particular item and only one instance of that particular item, so it can be extremely inflexible. Polygon tagging, because of its global nature, just much more useful when you're using multiple copies of the same item within a set, for example. And another big drawback of using item masking is that, say you have 50 copies of this table, each one with its own individual item mask, you're going to end up with 50 versions of the same material in the shader tree. And obviously that's going to slow down your rendering, because the more materials the render has to evaluate, the slower your renders are going to be. Whereas if you use a polygon tag, you simply just use one version of the same material which is applied to all the instances of the table. Next, I check that there's no redundant locators here in the item list, because as you already know, any locators that are present in this scene will automatically be imported when the scene is referenced. I also check there's no redundant groups here in the group panel, because they might also be imported when the scene is referenced. On the other hand, I don't worry about items such as cameras, lights, or environments, because I can control whether those particular items are imported when the asset is referenced into a scene. And this is very convenient, because during the course of modeling and shading, you're going to need to do test renders, so you're going to need to have cameras in your working scenes, you're going to need to have lights. It's really useful to have different sets of HDRs in your environments to see exactly how your assets react in different lighting conditions. And you can keep all these assets in your working scenes, because later on when you decide to import this particular asset as a reference, you can simply opt to not import the cameras, the lights, and the environments that you were using while you're working on the asset itself. So now that the prop is ready and the file has been tidied up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to restart Modo, and then I'm going to open the layout file that I want to import this table into. So with my layout now open, I'm going to go to File, Import Reference, and I'm going to select the table.lxo, which I just saved out. And all I'm going to bring in, obviously, are the meshes and the materials and shaders. And here it is. You can see that it's now appeared in my scene. So the first thing to note is that when you bring in a reference, Modo is automatically going to item mask it. So in my shader tree, I've got this group here called table, which is item masked to this folder here in the item list, and that folder contains the freshly imported reference. This automatic item masking is simply a safeguard against unpredictable results with your shading, just in case you got duplicate polygon tags or bad naming conventions, that kind of thing. But as you already know, I tend to avoid item masking, so I'll show you how I personally handle this situation. But before I do that, I'm going to talk about how you can use multiple copies of the same referenced asset. And this actually ties in quite closely with the problems relating to item masking, and it'll help to demonstrate exactly why I don't particularly like to use item masking in my scenes. So there's two ways in which you can use multiple versions of the same referenced asset in Modo. One thing you must not do is to right click and duplicate the folder that the reference is in, because that's actually going to make a copy baked into the scene that will no longer be referencing the original item on disk. So that's one to be avoided. One thing you can do, however, is to create an instance of the hierarchy. So I'm going to do that now. This instance is hierarchy, and I'm going to grab my move tool and move the instance away. And straight away you can see that it's lost the shading, and that's because of the item masking. So that's strike one against item masking. And the second way, and I think this is considered to be the more correct way, is to go to File and just import the same reference again. So I'm going to go File, Import Reference, and I'm going to bring in the table.lxo, and I'm going to bring in the meshes and materials and shaders again. And once again, I'm just going to grab my move tool. I need to select this table and move it away from the original. Now the problem we've got here is because of the automatic item masking, I've got two versions now of the material in the shader tree. And as I said earlier, this is really inefficient, because if I bring in 50 of these tables, I'm going to end up with 50 versions of this material, which is going to slow down my renders for no reason whatsoever. So instead of using this approach, I'm going to do it differently. So let me just undo this import. Okay, now we're back to where we were with just the one table in the scene. I'm going to go to File, Import Reference again. And once again, I'm going to choose the table.lxo, but this time I'm not going to bring in the materials and shaders. I'm just going to bring in the mesh. Now let me just select this here in the item list and move it away. Now once again, the shading is only applied now to the original table, and that's because of the item mask on this group here. So in order to apply this polygon tag, which is a global property after all, onto all of the tables in the scene, there's several things I could do. I could grab this shader and this material group and simply drag them out of this item mask group. Or if I want to keep the group for organizational purposes, I simply remove the item mask and set the scope to all. And once I do this, you can see that the shading is now applied to all of the tables. But the big benefit of using this approach is that I'm not duplicating my materials unnecessarily. I've got one table material which is applied to all of the different tables. Now if you want to delete a referenced item from a scene, you can't just right click on it and select delete from the item list. That's going to produce an error message. What you need to do is to right click on the topmost folder and go to the references menu, and from the sub menu here you can select delete imported reference, and that's going to delete it from the scene, as you can see here. Now similarly, if you wanted to replace a referenced item, you'd use the same menu. So I'm going to replace this table with a different asset that I've got with different shading. Now remember that I've done a local override here by removing the item masking on this group. So I'll select the table reference item and right click and go to references, and from the sub menu I'm going to select replace imported reference, and this time I'm going to choose a different file on disk which has got different shading. Now once again I'm going to import the meshes and the shaders. And it's going to come up with this lost overrides dialog box, and that's because the new file that I'm using is using completely different textures from the old one. So I'm going to simply ask it to discard these overrides. And as I do this, you can see I've got an updated asset in preview, but most importantly, my local override on this group has still been preserved, which means that the item masking is set to all. And at this stage I can do some more local overrides if I want to. If I expand the group in the shader tree, or indeed the group in the item list, you can see that I've got full access to everything within the subscene. So if I wanted, for example, to add a new texture in the shader, let's just do that now. You can see that I've got complete control, but this is a local override. It doesn't have the symbol that the referenced items have. This is simply local to the scene and won't be propagated back to the original item on disk. And I can also make channel overrides. So for example, if I want to go to this shader and I say don't cast shadows, you can see that I can update this locally in my scene, but once again this is only local to the scene and won't be propagated back to the original referenced item. So it gives me a lot of power to control things on a scene by scene basis. And of course I also have the ability to save this scene on disk and import it itself into a new scene while still preserving all of the local overrides on the nested references. And this can be really useful in a lighting and rendering workflow because it means that you can set up key shots that you base other shots on. So for example, you could have a key shot where you import a set, a character, and then do some lighting. And you find that during the course of setting up your shot, you need to do some local overrides because some shaders in particular need a finer shading rate. You need to tweak some materials for the purposes of your shot. And then for any other shots that are going to have similar lighting and going to have similar requirements in terms of shading quality and whatever other overrides you've done, you can simply reference in your key shot and then carry on doing local overrides on top of that. And that not only helps you to maintain consistency between shots, but it also means that whenever you go back to the original key shot and make changes there, those changes can be automatically propagated to any shots that are similar. So you can see that the new referencing system is indeed very flexible and powerful, and there's any number of ways that you can adapt it to suit your own particular workflow or pipeline. You'll see my approach in the project-based part of this video, but I hope this has served as a useful introduction to how the system works.